1743, a slave in Delaware, and he was sold in his youth to another slaveholder in Philadelphia in the time when slavery was not yet banned in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Go ahead and be seated. At that time, the day came in the year 1776, in July of that year, when the bells rang all across that city of Philadelphia, and where the whole city was abuzz, and people were talking about the great things, the exciting things that were going on in that city. And as Absalom Jones by then had learned to read, I'm certain he read in the newspaper that next day that the delegates meeting in Philadelphia had just written this Declaration of Independence and had just ratified this document, and that this document, its preamble, would say that we believe these things to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet I'm equally certain that Absalom Jones knew from that very day, and yet even before, that he would have to work and strive, and his people also, with every ounce of his heart, soul, body, mind, and strength to earn even a fraction of the recognition that would be just given to the white community in Philadelphia. And I am certain also from that day that Absalom Jones' mission continued, and in the following years, of course, he would go on to walk out with Richard Allen from St. George's Church, and to go on to found St. Thomas's and the Free African Society, and go on to help to bring what we know now as UBE, and the black community in the Episcopal Church. And so as I think about it, I'm reminded of this gospel text that we are no longer to be called servants, we're to be called friends. What does that mean, that we are no longer servants, but we are friends? Well, I'm not the first preacher to point out that the word used in the Greek that's translated as servant is the Greek word doulos, which is translated oftentimes as slave. I did a little research, and it turns out that this same word is used 7 other times in the Gospel of John, and 130 times over the course of the New Testament, where in our New Revised Standard translation puts it as slave. And so you can think of this: you are no longer to be called slaves, but you are to be friends. For the slave does not know what the master is doing, does not know the master's business. Now, I was puzzling over that all weekend, for weeks before this, and I have to admit, I came to sort of realize, or I came to think that, you know, sometimes in our community, in the African-American community, I actually don't sometimes think we've come as far from those days of Absalom Jones as we like to think we have. I happen to tutor school children most days of the week, and so I am constantly thinking about how, just as in the days of Absalom Jones when it was illegal to teach blacks to read, today African Americans are at a distinct disadvantage, facing the lowest high school graduation rates and the lowest literacy rates of any racial or ethnic group in this country. Just as in the days of chains and of bondage, when our ancestors were carried around in shackles, hand and foot, I'm reminded that 1 in every 9 African Americans is caught up in the prison system, whether on parole or in jail or awaiting trial or serving a prison sentence, many of which, of course, are exorbitant prison sentences. I'm reminded at the same time of how our families are broken up, how just in the time when it was common practice to sell families apart from one another. Indeed, Absalom Jones was sold apart from his mother and father from Delaware to Pennsylvania, probably to never see them again. In fact, we have no record that he ever saw or heard from his family ever again, just as in those times, we live in a time when the breakup of African-American families is at a point where it's greater than any time in recent generations. I got to keep from getting myself in a little bit of trouble here. But we're at a time when more black boys and black girls are growing up not knowing their fathers and their mothers, not having relationships with their parents than ever before. Where are we? Where have we come from? I think we've forgotten. We've forgotten so many times. We've forgotten so much about where we come from and the people that brought us to where we are. It's that old phrase you hear, if you haven't learned from your past, if you don't learn from your history, then what? You're doomed to repeat it, right? So, you all might know that I happen to come from a long line of Baptist preachers. Some of you who have heard me preach before will not be surprised by that fact. But part of what that means to me is that I'm not adverse to the phrase, open your Bibles with me. So we're going to do a little activity. I want you to open your Bibles with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you don't have one, I will give you one. And whoever finds the verse in your Bible, yell out what number it is in case anybody is having a hard time finding it out. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10. Oh, and for those of you who have this version, I apologize for the tiny text. 266 in the burgundy ones? Okay. And I'll open with you in this one.
Chapter, what did you say? What chapter? 10?
Chapter 6, verse 10. All right, and in the blue Bibles, it is page 77. We'll start reading at verse 10. And by the way, I'll give you a little context. This is when Moses is standing, having brought the people out of captivity in Egypt, and he's standing with the River Jordan and the Promised Land and Canaan behind him, and he's standing with the desert and Egypt ahead, looking back with his people standing on one edge, getting ready to cross into the land of freedom. And this is what he says. So it shall be, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of all good things, which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. When you have eaten and are full, then beware, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. I'm going to skip down to verse 20. When your son asks in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of these testimonies, the statutes and the judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe, against Egypt, Pharaoh, and all his household. Then he brought us out from there that he might bring us in to give us the land which he swore to our fathers. Amen? Amen. So what does that mean? Well, it's not just we African Americans in this country who have been struggling with this concept of remembering the Lord our God who brought us out of the land of bondage. No, it is also even Moses, thousands of years ago, was struggling and dealing with the same concept. And what does he tell his people as they're about to cross into the land of freedom? He says, don't you ever forget where you came from. Don't you ever forget how you got here. Don't you ever forget that you were in bondage. And don't you ever forget that you're not in bondage anymore. I am a firm believer, if a believer in nothing else, I believe that the moment we forget that we came out of bondage, the moment we forget the Lord who brought us out of there, is the moment we slip into new forms of bondage. Oh, come on. I'm convinced beyond a doubt, not only of that, but that we are compelled by knowing our history, by remembering our history, by remembering how we got out of bondage, we are compelled to move forward. We have no choice then but to be proud of who we are. We have no choice but to continue to strengthen our communities. We have no choice but to continue to improve, not just for ourselves, but for one another, for our brothers and sisters, and for our neighbors. The prophet Isaiah reminds us in the reading that we read just a few minutes ago that this is a communal activity. Our praying and our continuing and our remembering our history and our telling our children about our history is a part of our obligation to one another. What does Isaiah say? He tells us that we are to proclaim justice to the captives and freedom to those who are in prison. So it's not just our duty to take care of ourselves and to remember so that we progress on our own. We are to proclaim justice to the captives. We are to proclaim justice to people who are still in educational deficiency. We are to proclaim justice to people whose families are still being broken up. We are to proclaim justice to people who are incarcerated and freedom to those who are in prison. Oh, what an obligation the gospel gives us. What an obligation and what a joy and a privilege we have as those who have been brought out of the land of bondage. Now, I'm also a good Episcopalian, and so I know about how long to go before it's time to close up shop. I've been just staying a long time. So I will go ahead and close with this. As the preachers say, I'm going to say one more thing and then I'm going to take my seat. A couple of months ago, I was leading a seminar on racial profiling. And a woman stood up and she asked me, can't we just be Americans? Why do we have to call ourselves African Americans or Caucasian Americans or Hispanic Americans or Asian Americans? Why can't we all just be Americans? It's not a bad question. So I paused and I thought for a moment and I said, well, a couple of months before I had the pleasure to take a trip to visit the largest and one of the oldest slave trading forts on the coast of West Africa. I stood in the slave dungeons, in the male and female dungeons, where our ancestors were carried. I stood in the door of no return, from which my own ancestors were carried out in chains and loaded onto ships into unspeakable degradation, the likes of which even our worst nightmares could not fathom. I could not be more proud that I come from people who came from such circumstances and rose up to build cities that I live in and did not build, to build schools that I've attended and did not create, that dug wells that I did not dig and planted trees that I did not plant, but I have the benefit of living into them and using those resources. I couldn't be more proud to come from the brilliant African stock of people who rose up out of the worst of possible circumstances to create churches like the one we stand in and worship in today. Don't you ever let anybody tell you that you don't come from the best. Don't let anybody make you feel inferior. Don't let anybody make you feel like you don't come from people to be proud of. Don't you ever forget your history. Remember, remember, remember always. And tell your children, and tell them to tell their children. Continue our history. And it's not just us as African Americans. I told this seminar on racial profiling that it is our duty and it is our honor to love not just our histories and learn not just our histories, but to learn and love one another as if they were our own. Only then can we love the God who created us and created our ancestors. Only then can we love the God who brought us out of bondage. So love yourself, and love your history, and love your neighbor. And remember that you are no longer slaves. Remember that you're no longer slaves to any person. In this Lenten season, we remember that we are no longer slaves to sin. And yes, you are no longer even sin